I'm Jon Sharples. I'm an art lawyer, and I've also been billed as a broadcaster and curator, two things I do occasionally. Very pleased to be speaking with Andrew Hewish. I'm not going to war memorialise his CV. It's available around here. It says here that his works are collected globally in prestigious institutions like Victoria and Albert Museum and the Warburg Institute, but also in my house. The first painting I ever bought was by Andrew. Did you know that? Was it? Yes. So I'd bought some paper and drawings, but the first painting I ever bought was by Andrew. The thing that isn't mentioned on some of the material is Andrew's pedagogy. So he's been a senior lecturer in art in various prestigious places, and some of my favourite artists have studied under you, if that's the correct preposition. And so Andrew's influence amongst contemporary artists in London over the last 10 years was enormous. So we're here to talk about this show, but Vivienne put together a new word for me, Huperballó.
It's a new word for me too.
How would you say it?
That sounds good.
Huperballó. And from the same linguistic root as hyperbole, it's exactly the same etymology, but hyperbole being an exaggeration, Huperballó being a throwing beyond and exceeding of expectation or place or space or time.
I think it's probably more positive than hyperbole.
Yes, exactly. I think you may have been accused of hyperbole occasionally, but I think here we're looking at this concept of the transformative power of art and the capacity of art objects to take you out of yourself and out of your place and out of your condition. So this body of work on this side of the room is the product of a residency in Greece back last year.
May 2024.
So it's all recent work. And this body of work on this wall is a collaboration with Daphne Italy, Daphne Astor, made in 2013. And I always think of Andrew as being an artist who could single-handedly stage a group show of his own work because he worked so proficiently in so many different visual languages, and that's probably something we'll talk about. So I'm going to approach this slightly self-indulgently and talk about a few of the reasons why I like this work. So that's good news, and what it reminds me of, and why I think it works. And maybe you can say whether you think I'm getting it based on what I say. So I enjoy anything in the world and visual culture that sort of has an inherent sense of vitality and dynamism, and it doesn't necessarily have to come from within a formal art setting. So some of the best painting you'll ever see anywhere is on a retail unit that has been closed, and the window has been whitewashed in some way, and there's something very satisfying about the sort of material and dynamic quality of that as painting. And some of these paintings remind me of that, just not necessarily coming from an art historical point of view, but all of this does refer to art history in some way. How could painting not? I'm speaking a lot here, so I need to formulate a question soon. But
I would say certainly vitality is a key interest. It certainly comes out particularly strongly in these works.
Yes.
I think partially because Tinos is an island that is energized. The atmosphere, the wind, the clouds, the water. It's almost as if every particle around you is energized, and it's in the Cyclades. And Meraki House, which hosted the residency, is quite high up, so you can see the Cyclades cycling around each other, cycling around Delos. It's as if the whole world is in motion. So the vitality was very much something that I was after.
And
out of that.
So these works are of that place and of that residency, but obviously not in a literal sense. Not really about light on water or landscape. It's more about the atmosphere and the culture of a place.
Yes.
And and linked to the title of the show, all of these works have these classical, sort of slightly grandiose titles, and very much in the mode of sort of Zeithumbling. And what is it you're reaching for when you sort of reference that classicism?
Certainly Zeithumbling is a reference in that he produced a workable language. I'm very interested in artists that produce a workable language, which means it's operable. You can take it and do something with it. So there's a generosity, I think, in his work. And certainly there's one work here which I think of as a Psy-type, in that it's a direct cue to his language. Mm-hmm. But he created work that could be handed to other people and say, and now off you go, you can actually use this language. In the same way, Sienese painting produced a language that people could then use. So rather than it being in the style of, it's more taking a cue from and employing some of that language. So this is marble plaster, so a mixture of marble dust and plaster. And you might recognize the way he's using that. But he also had that, excuse me, a relation to history. And it's always up for grabs what his relation to history was. And I guess history and language were his two poles, plus materiality, which are key interests that I have. That is of his generation, but certainly going back and back and back. And some of these small models, I think, also come from early Soviet models as well, but that I think he was probably taking a cue from.
And what's your relationship with history? And what relationship with history are you sort of claiming when you call a painting Helios or Maenad or all these great titles? Like how do you see this studio practice in that great timeline?
Yeah, so that it goes to a question I have about experience and how we hold experience. Or going back to say observational painting of a place or that landscape. I was standing here, I did this in this moment. I find that difficult in that our experience is so complicated, it's so dense, and it's never that single moment, it's always all of our moments compressed or collapsed, and they form. So the question, I think, for an artist who might want to say, well, I'm interested in conveying something of experience itself, is therefore the challenge is to produce that density of how it is that we hold our own experience. And so history is a part of that, because it's never that moment, it's that moment plus all of your other moments.
Yes, and not just your moments. All of our moments, because the certainty of all of this is that you bring your own material associations to these works, yep. Or will see a shape, and you can't resist drawing an association with other shapes that you've seen, yep. Like this.
And I think of that as an insistent object, that it insists itself somehow because it's pushing all sorts of associations and buttons. And producing in that moment of the reception of the work, that sense of collapse by which we hold experience. But history with a capital H is also part of our experience. I mean, yes, I wasn't at the Trojan War, but I've read things about it. It's embedded in our experience. We carry this as part of a long history in Western culture. It's there whether we like it or not, and depending on how much interest you've shown in them. It's that the Greek world was a complicated world. It was a world full of stories and very complicated characters. And it's difficult, I think, to be in Greece and not feel the pulse of that history and those characters. So some of the titles, Maenad, for instance, yes, it's a trope from ancient Greece, but it's also a dialogue with art history itself. So A.B. Warburg, who was Daphne's great uncle, and whose library is one of the great 10 best libraries always in those lists, it's here in London, he was interested in the vitality of work and the existence through time of that vitality. And how is that even possible? And understanding visuality as a language itself and its recurrence. So a title like Maenad is a cue from that, and those Maenad paintings are taken from sketches I do whenever I come across a Golden Age Greek sculpture.
Right.
Because of the particular dynamism of the folds, and they become a cue for those paintings. But another work, such as the Megara, is one of the Furies, is an embodiment for the Greeks of jealous rage. I mean, that's just a great topic in itself. So I wouldn't just, it's not a casual title, it's a very, and the sculpture was done with that in mind, because I had already done a Fury, and I thought, well, she's interesting. What would that look like as a sculpture?
So what's the link between jealous rage and an individual sculpture?
Well, this particular sculpture, I mean, it has, I'm a big fan of Louise Bourgeois's work, and her work, she draws on a language of illustration, both in the paintings and in her sculptures, but also a more concrete negotiation of space. But ultimately, it's an architecture of experience. So the Megara sculpture has a great fuzzy ball of found metal that I've squished and shaped that can embody as a structure that jealous rage that we've all felt.
I love this, and they have such a relationship with drawing, because Andrew does this great performance lecture that I haven't heard for a long time about the line, and this has such a clear sort of link to drawing, and also it reminds me a lot of, I saw a great show in New York last year by Christopher Wall, and Christopher Wall involved in, I don't know, leaching the expressionism out of abstract expressionism, resolving one of those art historical dust-ups. And I see you as involved in some of the same thing.
Very much so, yeah. On that particular use of line in that sculpture, it's, for me, drawing is key to drawing is line and how we might follow a line, how our mind might inhabit a line. But in the case of that sculpture, it turns in on itself and clogs itself and in a way that jealous rage can do. So there's a meeting of those two things there. In terms of abstract expressionism, I use gesture in a particular way, which is to use the gesture as a distancing. It's not a gesture that you can follow in the abstract expressionist I felt, therefore I am brushstroke. It's not a brushstroke, a gesture that you can reanimate to follow it, because I've gone over them several times. So they collapse back into design and don't give you the opportunity to inhabit the speed or direction of the gesture. So again, there's another art historical dialogue that's part of my experience that collapses into this broader experience.
It also dares you, I think, to think of it as being a bit random, and so, or at least it exists on the edge between sort of intention and what Donald Judd might have described as the difference between the general and the specific. There's some there that's just harnessing the general. Some of it is very intentional and manipulated, but never quite.
Which goes back to, for me, where I think gesture is at its most powerful, and that's a gesture can be open or it can be closed. And so there is an opening for me in a gesture of that sort. And similarly, I hope with most of the work, there's no closure there. Mm-hmm. They keep echoing with associations or echoing with a fuzzy logic of some sort, and you don't get to conclude and walk away. Which is an openness of gesture for me.
Yes, I think that's right. I think it's more generous to a viewing experience than a more kind of closed and directly.
And they're made in that way too. Going back to the title of today, experience and making. They are made in that way that I am fumbling through. There's a great history, I think, in the UK of fumbling through, hoping that something good will arise out of this philosophically.
Yes.
And I think that's part of what I'm doing in the work is testing these various forms, seeing what emerges, going with that, leaving that behind. It's not pre-cooked in any way.
Just flitting back to the notion of the stories that these potentially relate to and the stories that the titles hint at, something it makes me think of is that one difference between now and when Twombly was giving those titles to his work is back then there might have been this expectation that every educated person knows who wrote about this myth or that myth. And part of what this makes me reflect on is how sort of fragmented our culture has become in terms of how many stories we can rely on everyone knowing. Yes. You know, that there aren't so many. Once upon a time, you'd have 20 million people in the UK all watch the same episode of Only Fools and Horses, and you could sort of rely on some shared cultural references. But now, our experience in the world is so fragmented and so personalised, actually, we have so few of those universal stories anymore. And so part of this harks back to me, to a kind of age of big shared myths that more or less everyone had some familiarity or relationship with.
Yes, but now no one needs to retain anything because you can just search it immediately. So there is a game to be played here. If you want to search the name, come up with the associations, then you can, and that will unfold for you. So it isn't a question of who's on the inside or who's on the outside. It's more, there's a density here to be explored.
Although it's probably fair to say, isn't it, that some people now will come to this and feel like an outsider to see some of these titles. And
yeah, I think also in Twombly's time, he was playing a game, and a critic said as much in terms of when he writes Achilles on a painting, what are we meant to take from that? Yeah. And in a way, he was also saying it's an open process. There is no standard idea of what that's meant to represent, and also that history is in retreat from us. We don't have a direct association with Achilles. We have, as you say, a private association.
Yes.
And I don't pursue Greek history as a general theme in my work. It was just pulsing at me in this particular occasion. My last show was centered on motion and architecture with reference to Japanese temples and graphic work from the 19th, from the Edo period. So,
which brings me on to what I'm thinking right now, which is another sensibility that we have in common, and I think that is another way into this work for me. So as well as liking street painting, I love a kind of cabinet of curiosities,
right? Yeah.
Or an encyclopedia, yeah. And the idea that I too am a sort of magpie, and probably I'm not so interested in mastering the depth of any of these areas, but the kind of excitement that it's all there and up for grabs. And
yes.
You either find that sort of exciting, and the idea that a bit of tempera on linen connects you to ancient histories and there's an invitation to go there. So that will appeal to some people, but for others will feel exclusive as well.
Yes, but and I think it's worth noting that I'm not ventriloquizing a Greek scholar or a Greek person.
Yeah.
It's simply that, as you say, it's about the encounter with these subjects and the way they might open up something else. So, and the openness of the work hopefully means people can bring whatever they bring to them, discover something of what they might suggest, and that encounter produces a flowering that is, as I'm meeting these subjects, they're meeting them too, and something open and interesting happens. It's setting up the possibility of meeting in the Umberto Eco sense rather than actually delivering a message.
Yeah. So if someone came in here, they probably wouldn't suspect that these two bodies of work were made by the same artist, but what is the shared sensibility between working in this collage mode and your painting practice, which relies on a lot of serialization and...
Yeah. So certainly working in series is interesting for me, and the collages when I do works on paper, they tend to be collages. They tend always to use language, so they tend to exert language in some way, and then that language is offset against various other visual qualities that are happening in the collage. So it's producing, again, a collapse, a shock, that is also to do with language, in a way that I see the series of paintings as developing a particularity to that series, as opposed to, say, the last paintings I made. It's a language. It's a visual language that hopefully is itself productive, but and there's a collapse in the collages that produces a charge, in the same way that I hope that all of these objects, and to me the paintings are also very much objects, produce a density and a collapse, and as well as an offering.
Yeah. I think the density is interesting, isn't it? Because Andrew is a great curator, I think, of spaces and the choreography of energy that's involved in how you put things together, and that is obviously a highly relevant idea to collage, and I think it flatters you as a viewer, because actually you have to come along and complete the work by drawing the associations, or enjoying the incongruity of a combination that shouldn't work but does. And I'm very interested in some of the presentational choices you made, like this framing device of having paintings abutting each other, separated by a divider.
So for me, they're a single work. Yeah. And it was something that came out of an interest in the stations of the Tokaido, because they produce, going back to the architecture of experience, or how you navigate the space of those paintings, because a rectangle of a painting is, historically, it's singular, it pulls that energy in, and you focus on that. What happens when there's 4 of them, as there is here, or 2 in a vertical format separated by a battle? So it's one painting, there's just 2 panels. And it goes, but it's not dissimilar to the collage in that you have to navigate those various spaces and those various elements. So collage, I think, for me, does 2 things. One is that it separates and keeps a separation, but it also produces a unified work in the end, but manages to balance those things at the same time.
With this display, and like the previous one you did in here, I enjoy the fact that it's an essentially ambulatory experience, in the sense that I think these are best enjoyed by walking by them and letting that language unfold as if it's one complete work. And of course, not every painting benefits from being seen in that way. I didn't like the Rothko show at the Louis Vuitton Foundation last year, because I think those paintings are designed to dominate the field of vision and to not have anything else in the periphery.
Yeah.
So for me, they were diminished by being bang, bang, bang.
And I think they were probably painted as big man painting.
Right, exactly. And so there's something interesting about this, which is that they benefit from each other's company, which isn't true of all paintings.
So they're similar but not similar.
Right. I hadn't seen anyone else use this sort of divider in a mode of presentation before, and that's really interesting. And also, maybe this is a bit literal, but it is itself a line, a continuity, a chain back to that studio experience. So I feel a bit like you're laying the breadcrumbs, and I could follow you back to your studio. And actually, what we're all enjoying and experiencing is that trail from the studio out into.
And the studio is a mess.
Right. I know. I've seen it. Yeah.
It's a deliberate mess, and it ties in very much with the exhibition, in that it's the collision of that mess that, just as it's the collision of the experience with art history or history generally or every other painting I've ever seen, those collisions produce something. And so part of the investigation I was doing here was looking for some idea of ancient Greek perpetual motion. So what I did find was Aristotle on kinisi and the kinetic, that when things collide and when they're in motion, that's when something really happens. For him, things don't really happen unless they're in motion. And so the central problem as part of this that gives us the name Huperballó is that we are given things, we are thrown into this world, and we're given all of these structures, including art structures, art historical structures. And a question for anyone making is, how do you get beyond those structures? So for me, the collision of the materials and happenstance and the fumbling is a way of producing things that are unexpected for me. And those collisions of things produce a new reality, the throwing out of or throwing beyond those things that produce, that keep us in place.
Yeah. But also with a deliberate nod to things that are familiar and playing against that, because I think a lot in your work, I often have a feeling of déjà vu that I can't quite put my finger on, and it's partly to do with shapes, I suppose. So there's one word that's Nike, and you that sort of bit of metal is like something you've seen in the Louvre. You just instinctively feel that. If you're kind of visually, I was going to say literate, but that sounds like a value judgment. But if
yeah, for me, it's just it's a synthetic quality of holding your experience. It's not a conscious thing, as Ed Sheeran says in his legal case. He's listened to a lot of music, and it's all in his head, and it comes out somehow. Hopefully, mine is.
And there are only so many permutations. is part of those conversations. Since you're talking about legal cases, so I am an art lawyer, and something that lawyers occasionally are asked to opine upon is the definition of art, which is definitely not a question that should be left to a lawyer's hands. But for various historical accidental reasons, whether or not something is artistic determines whether or not it's protected. And one of the things I always think about that question is, well, something is in the category of art if it is intentionally designed to interact with the body of knowledge that we think of as being art.
Right.
Well, it's not a very snappy definition.
It's not very snappy.
But it's not related to how it looks.
Yeah.
So it's not about a kind of aesthetic quality. But if you have an object or a gesture that you intend to engage the body of knowledge and the boundaries of that body of knowledge would be contested, and different people have different ideas. But if you have an idea that there's a history and there's a tradition and there's a body of knowledge that we think of as being art, if you do something that engages with that, then that probably gets you into that category.
Which for me gets you halfway there.
Okay.
And I would say painting, for instance, is foremost about painting.
Yeah.
It's always about painting.
Yeah.
And then it's about something else. I would add to that art speaks in a language that is not language as we understand. In terms of the way we're talking or writing, etc., it's a different language. It does things that language can't do. Mm-hmm. And again, this is one of A.B. Warburg's investigations, was to try and find the logic of art and visuality and its recurrence and its potency, and so it attempted to produce a science of understanding of that artistic language, and so art provides these things that everything else doesn't do. So it would be interesting to see if the legal profession can incorporate some sense of art producing this other quality of being thrown beyond the ordinariness of the things that are known, that are embedded in language. When we use language, it's not ours. It's not our own. It's always the shared language that we're fumbling towards and understanding with somebody else. But art circumvents that. It hijacks that process, and there's a possibility there that Proust talks about, which is an intersubjective quality, that art, its methods, not its content, its methods and its style, produces something by which other people can recognise that someone else is in the universe.
Wow, what a beautiful big thought that is, and I think that that reaching for the grandeur of history is exactly, that's why it's so exciting. It's that it's a feeling of vitality that collapses geography and time and space, and that's where art can take you.
It's a way of understanding being or experience.
Do you know, I like that so much. I'm actually just going to stop there. Has anyone? Yes, there's a question.
Could you speak about patina?
That's right. In terms of your okay, just for the recording, where you're referring to a kind of material atmosphere.
Yeah, and I see it here. There's they speak to each other absolutely.
Yeah,
so
and
then sensitivity that even shows up in your sculpture.
Yeah, and there is an art history around atmosphere, sfumato, etc. And for me, atmosphere is not. It's a felt thing, it's a mood thing, it's a visual thing, but it's also a structural thing. And so it is something I'm very conscious of, but it's also about the object quality and where materiality meets the object quality. It produces a visual intensity as well. So it's a micro level of that collapse. Okay. Yeah. And if you stand in front of a painting, it's a very different thing to just, in terms of that, could be scumbling or either those very micro levels of experience that we have. I like to produce paintings that have strange visual qualities in them, even at the level of the pigment. So there's malachite in the green one there, and there's lapis in the other one. Partially that's because they have great optical qualities, but at a certain level, if you haven't seen it before, at some level your body registers that.
Right.
And so for me, embodiment is very important. Again, about short-circuiting the language, what is known. And so obviously the sculptures have a kind of obvious reference to our embodiment. But for me, painting should also trigger something of, oh yes, I have a body, I forgot.
And these are a mildly countercultural thing now, in a sense that they're impossible to photograph. Right? They're reassuringly hard to capture. You can't tell someone what this show is like by reference to photographs. It's a cliche. You have to come and see it for yourself. You have to be in front of it and experience it.
Well, I do think that's a demand for any artist now, is what is it that is not being done? Yeah. What is it but is different to everything else that's out there?
Can I have a follow-up question, please? I was thinking that in the Mediterranean, May, the light's so bright, right? And there's a Christmas to the crispness. And I'm struck by the fact that you were able to somehow stay away from, did the light not affect your hand?
So someone who spent a lot of time in the Greek islands said, everyone does these really crisp, bright colours, but he said, you've managed to capture the bleaching effect.
Yes.
Interesting.
The light is everywhere, and the particles are everywhere. There's refraction everywhere, and the light is so strong,
right,
that you think it's colourful, but actually it's so bleaching.
Right, and there's a certain kind of light, isn't there, where you don't perceive a blue sky. Actually, it's a kind of blinding white sky. That's how it's not as intense.
You're squinting through it.
Anyone else? Okay, maybe we'll just...
Yep, there you go.
That's wonderful.
The sculptures involve found objects. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, that's part of the collision of objects and part of trying to circumvent the deliberateness or any kind of packaged result of what I'm after. So happenstance and the finding of object, and those objects carrying their history through in the same way that the history carries their history through, produces a shock. And for me, invention is, we haven't really talked about, but invention is key, I think, for me, for the work, is I'm always testing myself to see how inventive it's possible to be. And when there's an unfamiliar object that you find, that's part of the challenge.
This thing about the object quality, I think that's my view, that art is inherently self-referential, could, to some people, sound unpromising, because you'd imagine you get diminishing returns if you're constantly looking in and referring to the same body of knowledge. But the thing that will always save it is that we are of material, and we just love being in the presence of material, and that experience, even if, so your comment that painting, the first thing painting is about is painting before it's about anything, but the second thing it's definitely is about is just the excitement of the interaction of humble materials. Like, that never gets old. It's always exciting, and I am involved in various debates about repatriation of cultural objects, and this objects, like a few years ago at the Bristol Museum, there was a show about Herculaneum, and they had this sort of carbonized loaf of bread, and there's only a certain amount of cultural knowledge you can get from the object. So the reason the bread survived is because it was in the oven when Vesuvius erupted, so it's protected within the stone oven, but immediately carbonized, and you can see the knowledge you can get from it is how it was carried, because there's a kind of circle round that you might carry its string, and how it was cut into its pieces. And so once you've got that knowledge, extract that knowledge from the object, what's the ongoing usefulness of that object? And the usefulness of it is, and the excitement of it is, we recognize that we are made of the same stuff, and it has survived. It's a miracle. It's survived since a couple of thousand years, and we respect it for being material that's still here, like we are. And that's just exciting in a way that you can't, a 3D printed version of that does not replace what that is, and the 3D printed versions of these works can't get to what the object quality is.
There's certainly a lot of object history, I think, particularly in the sculptures that I'm conscious of and what they might carry. But I also think there's an interest I have in the idea that we can only see that which we recognize. Mm-hmm. In other words, if you don't know it already, can you see it? So by producing objects that are not known, not knowable, forces people to really look. Yeah, and I'm interested in that as a process. Hopefully you don't recognize these. You haven't seen these. There are insinuations of other associations, of course, but there's also the shock of, I don't quite know what that is.
Yeah. You were saying there's a transmission it's a language, right? So it's language personal as Hugh, but they're transmitting somehow. See if you have transmitted.
Yeah, because hopefully
by somebody else, whatever their interpretation, there's a value in that.
Yes, but also, as Jon was saying about ambulating around the space, and these paints are packed together for a reason, in that hopefully as you encounter, each one is dependent on the other. Painting I don't think is a standalone. It always has friends, and these paintings are friends in the Warburgian sense. They associate closely to each other, and produces for you a new language, hopefully. So if the exhibition can produce a new language that you come to know as you walk around it, then I've achieved something.
And the next step you might do, that you go out into the street and think, actually, the way that object sits, or the way that light falls, sort of reminds me of what I've just seen. Or you might go out and you might see a bit of pipe, or you might see the Cyrus cylinder of this museum, or and think all of that's there in these objects. They're sort of open-ended enough to carry on resonating as forms when you go out into the world and see other forms.
That the plinth and the baton is a material relationship.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's the same material.
Props.
Yes, well, yes, the plinths were
In the studio.
to plinth or not to plinth. These were sort of halfway in between. Yeah. Yes, it's the stuff of the studio, absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Well, perhaps everyone will join me in congratulating Andrew on the show as well.